I'm Saffron Pierce, 31, and for 3 years I believed I was a failed artist whose work wasn't good enough for the walls of Meridian Gallery, where I worked as an assistant. My boss Harrison Blackwood had convinced me my paintings were amateur attempts, fit only for storage in the gallery's basement. What I discovered last Tuesday would shatter that illusion and launch me into the most dangerous game of my life. Before I reveal how I turned the tables on one of New York's most respected art dealers, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And hit that subscribe button if you've ever been told your dreams weren't worth pursuing. The Meridian Gallery occupied 3 floors of a converted brownstone on the Upper East Side, its pristine white walls and dramatic lighting creating the perfect backdrop for million-dollar masterpieces. I'd been working there since graduating from Parsons with a fine arts degree and crushing student debt that made my monthly ramen diet a necessity rather than a choice. Harrison Blackwood had hired me ostensibly because of my art background, though my daily tasks involved more coffee runs and client schmoozing than anything remotely creative. Harrison was everything I'd imagined a successful gallery owner would be, silver-haired, impeccably dressed with connections that stretched from Soho to Switzerland. At 58, he commanded respect in art circles I could only dream of accessing. When he'd looked at my portfolio during my interview, his expression had been carefully neutral. "Interesting work?" he'd said, which I'd later learn was Harrison's polite way of saying utterly unremarkable. My small studio apartment in Queens was cramped with canvases I'd painted during weekend escapes from the gallery's demanding schedule. Abstract pieces that played with light and shadow, portraits that captured emotion in unexpected ways, landscapes that transformed familiar scenes into something otherworldly. I painted because I had to, the way some people need to breathe. But after 3 years of Harrison's subtle dismissals and the art world's resounding silence, I'd begun to wonder if talent was just another word for delusion. The discovery that would change everything happened by accident, as the most important revelations often do. Harrison had asked me to retrieve some documents from the basement storage area, a windowless maze of shelves holding everything from damaged frames to artworks deemed unworthy of display. I was searching for acquisition records from 2019 when I knocked over a box, sending papers scattering across the concrete floor. As I gathered the documents, one invoice caught my eye. It was from Ashford Auction House, dated 6 months earlier, listing the sale of Midnight Reverie by an artist named S. Meridian for $2.3 million. The title was familiar, though I couldn't place why. Then I saw the accompanying photograph, and my blood turned to ice. It was my painting, the abstract piece I'd completed last year, inspired by late nights walking through Central Park. The piece Harrison had dismissed as technically adequate but lacking commercial appeal when I'd shyly shown it to him. Except now it bore a different signature and was attributed to an artist I'd never heard of. My hands shook as I continued searching through the papers. Invoice after invoice revealed the same pattern, my paintings retitled and reattributed to S. Meridian, selling for astronomical sums at prestigious auction houses. Harbor Dreams had gone for $1.8 million. Fractured Light had fetched $2.7 million. Pieces I'd created over the past 3 years, believing them to be worthless experiments, had generated over $15 million in sales. S. Meridian, the pseudonym was so obvious in hindsight it made me sick. Saffron Meridian, my first name combined with the gallery's name. Harrison had been selling my work under a false identity while convincing me I had no talent worth displaying. I photographed every document with trembling fingers, my mind racing to process the magnitude of the betrayal. Not only had Harrison stolen my work, but he'd systematically destroyed my confidence, making me doubt my abilities while profiting from them. The careful critiques that had crushed my spirit were deliberate psychological manipulation designed to keep me compliant and unaware. That evening, I sat in my apartment surrounded by the paintings Harrison had never seen, staring at the evidence of his theft. The logical response would have been to contact the police, hire a lawyer, file reports with the art fraud division, but I knew how those battles played out for unknown artists against established dealers. Harrison had connections, resources, and 3 years of documented employment showing me as nothing more than a gallery assistant, my word against his empire. No, this required a different approach. Harrison had taught me well during my time at the gallery. I'd learned how auctions worked, how reputations were built and destroyed, how the art world's complex web of relationships could be manipulated by those who understood its intricacies. If Harrison wanted to play games with identity and authenticity, I would beat him at his own game. I spent the next week researching everything I could about Harrison's business practices, his clients, and the upcoming Pemberton auction, the year's most prestigious art sale, scheduled for 3 weeks away. Harrison always attended, using the event to network and secure new acquisitions. This year, he would get more than he bargained for. My plan required precision, patience, and a level of deception I'd never attempted before. I would need to forge documentation, create false identities, and manipulate the auction system itself. The risks were enormous. If caught, I'd face criminal charges that would destroy any chance of a legitimate art career. But the alternative was allowing Harrison to continue his theft while I remained trapped in a web of lies about my own abilities. The first phase involved establishing my alter ego. If Harrison could create Meridian, I would create someone even more compelling. I chose the name Celeste Hartwell, a reclusive European collector with a tragic backstory that would explain her sudden emergence in the art world. Using skills I developed in my digital art classes, I created a sophisticated online presence for Celeste, complete with a backstory involving a recently deceased husband who'd been a secret patron of emerging artists. Creating false documentation required connections I didn't naturally possess, but 3 years of working at Meridian had introduced me to the art world's shadowy edges. Tommy Reeves, a struggling artist who did restoration work for Harrison, had mentioned during a gallery event that he'd once helped adjust provenance documents for pieces with questionable histories. When I approached him with a carefully edited version of my situation, presenting it as research for a novel I was writing, he connected me with people who specialized in such services. The forged authentication documents cost me nearly every penny of my savings, but they were works of art themselves. Celeste Hartwell's collection now included 3 newly discovered pieces by the mysterious Meridian, complete with detailed provenance linking them to private European collections. The paintings I selected were pieces Harrison had never seen, works I'd completed before showing him any of my art. Meanwhile, I maintained my role at the gallery with Oscar-worthy performance. I arrived each morning with the same dutiful demeanor, brought Harrison his coffee with the same practiced smile, and handled client inquiries with the same professional efficiency. Inside, I was meticulously cataloging every detail of his operation, photographing documents when he stepped out, and mapping the relationships that formed his network of buyers and sellers. Harrison's office safe was protected by a code I'd observed him entering dozens of times during my tenure. Artists develop keen observational skills, and I'd unconsciously noted the pattern of his movements each morning when he retrieved the day's priority files. The safe contained additional evidence of his theft, original receipts showing the true source of paintings he'd sold under the Meridian name, along with communications with auction houses confirming his role as the mysterious artist's exclusive representative. 2 weeks before the Pemberton auction, I submitted Celeste Hartwell's consignment through an intermediary, a legitimate art consultant named Miranda Cross who specialized in private collections. Miranda's reputation was impeccable, and her discretion legendary. When I approached her as Celeste's representative, explaining that my client wished to remain anonymous due to personal circumstances, she accepted the commission without excessive questioning. The art world was full of eccentric collectors who preferred shadows to spotlights. The 3 paintings I submitted were among my strongest work. Eternal Twilight captured the moment between day and night, with layers of color that seemed to shift depending on viewing angle. Whispered Truths was a portrait series that revealed different emotions as the observer's perspective changed. Renaissance Echo was my interpretation of classical techniques applied to contemporary themes, a piece that had taken months to complete. Each painting was professionally photographed and catalogued with detailed condition reports. Miranda's team handled the authentication process, presenting Celeste's documentation to Pemberton's experts. The auction house's preliminary evaluation was enthusiastic. They estimated the 3 pieces would bring between $4 and $6 million combined, establishing Meridian as a significant contemporary artist worthy of major collector attention. Harrison learned about the consignment through his network of auction house contacts. During a casual conversation with Pemberton's modern art specialist, he discovered that Meridian pieces were being offered by an unknown collector. His immediate reaction was panic thinly disguised as professional curiosity. Meridian hasn't released new work in months. He told me that afternoon, pacing behind his desk with unusual agitation. This could destabilize the market if the pieces aren't authentic. I maintained my innocent expression while internally celebrating his discomfort. Should I contact Pemberton to express your concerns? No, he said quickly. I'll handle it personally. Meridian's work requires expert authentication. There are subtleties that only someone intimately familiar with the artist's techniques could recognize. His plan became clear over the following days. Harrison intended to attend the auction and publicly question the authenticity of the Meridian pieces, using his established relationship with the mysterious artist to cast doubt on their provenance. If successful, he would destabilize their value and potentially acquire them at significantly reduced prices before revealing their true authenticity through his exclusive connection to Meridian. What Harrison didn't realize was that I'd anticipated this strategy. The second phase of my plan required perfect timing and a revelation that would expose his entire operation before he could manipulate the auction's outcome. The night before the Pemberton auction, I made my final preparations. I'd arranged for a professional photographer to document Harrison's reactions during the sale, hired a journalist who specialized in art world investigations to attend the auction under the pretense of covering emerging market trends, and created a comprehensive dossier proving my true identity as the artist behind all Meridian works. I also made one final addition to Celeste Hartwell's backstory, a detail that would prove crucial in the coming confrontation. According to the documentation I'd prepared, Celeste's late husband had discovered his Meridian pieces through a gallery assistant who'd provided inside information about an unrecognized talent. This assistant had supposedly documented the entire process of how the artist's work was being misrepresented to maintain artificial scarcity in the market. The stage was set for a confrontation 3 years in the making. Harrison Blackwood, respected art dealer and master manipulator, was about to discover that his most submissive employee had learned far more from observing his methods than he'd ever intended to teach. The Pemberton Auction House occupied a landmark building in Midtown Manhattan, its grand auction room designed to intimidate and inspire in equal measure. Rows of burgundy velvet seats faced a raised platform where the world's most coveted artworks would be presented to an audience of collectors, dealers, and art world elite. The room hummed with anticipation as approximately 300 of the art world's most influential figures took their seats. I arrived early, dressed in a carefully chosen ensemble that would allow me to blend into the crowd while maintaining visual access to Harrison's usual seating area. He preferred the third row center, where his presence would be noted by other dealers while providing optimal viewing of each lot. I positioned myself several rows behind and to the left, close enough to observe his reactions but far enough to avoid casual recognition. Harrison entered precisely at the scheduled start time, his silver hair perfectly styled and his charcoal suit tailored to broadcast success. He moved through the room with the confidence of someone who'd attended hundreds of such events, nodding to familiar faces and exchanging pleasantries with potential clients. His demeanor appeared relaxed, but I noticed the slight tension in his shoulders and the way his fingers drummed against his catalog, signs of anxiety I'd learned to recognize during my years as his assistant. The auction proceeded through its early lots with typical efficiency. Pemberton's auctioneer, James Hartford, commanded the room with practiced ease, his British accent lending additional gravitas to each sale. Contemporary photography gave way to 20th-century sculpture, which transitioned into modern paintings. The audience's energy built steadily as the evening progressed toward the more significant lots. When the Meridian pieces appeared on the preview screens, I felt my heart rate accelerate despite months of preparation. Seeing my work displayed in such prestigious surroundings was surreal. These paintings had been created in my cramped apartment studio, often late at night when exhaustion made my brushstrokes looser and more expressive. Now they were being presented as treasures worthy of museum acquisition. Lot 127, Hartford announced, Eternal Twilight by Meridian, oil on canvas, 48 by 60 inches. This exceptional piece represents the artist's mature period, demonstrating the sophisticated color relationships and emotional depth that have established Meridian as one of today's most compelling contemporary voices. The bidding opened at $500,000 and quickly escalated. Paddle signals flashed throughout the room as collectors competed for the piece. Harrison sat motionless, his catalog closed, watching the proceedings with laser focus. When the bidding reached $1.2 million, he finally raised his paddle. His entry into the bidding created a stir of recognition among nearby attendees. Harrison's participation suggested either exceptional confidence in the piece's authenticity or insider knowledge about its true value. Other bidders began reassessing their strategies, some dropping out, while others increased their commitment. As the price climbed toward $2 million, Harrison appeared increasingly agitated. His breathing became shallow, and perspiration was visible on his forehead despite the room's controlled temperature. He was trapped in a bidding war for a piece he knew was authentic, because he'd been selling my work for years, but couldn't afford to reveal that knowledge without exposing his entire operation. At $2.3 million, Harrison stopped bidding. Eternal Twilight sold to a phone bidder represented by one of Pemberton's specialists. Harrison's expression was thunderous as he realized he'd been outmaneuvered by an anonymous competitor willing to pay more than even he considered reasonable for his artist's work. Lot 128, Hartford continued, Whispered Truths by S. Planks and Meridian, Mixed Media on Canvas, a series of 3 interconnected panels exploring themes of identity and revelation. This piece had special significance for me. It was the first painting where I'd felt truly confident in my artistic voice. The 3 panels could be viewed individually or as a unified composition, with each perspective revealing different emotional narratives. The technique had taken me months to perfect, layering transparent glazes to create depth that changed depending on lighting conditions. Harrison's bidding strategy for the second piece was more aggressive. He opened at the reserve price and maintained steady pressure as other collectors entered the fray. His message was clear: he would not be denied a second time. But as the bidding approached $3 million, a new participant emerged that caused his confident facade to crumble. "I have a bid from the room," Hartford announced, acknowledging a woman in the back section who'd raised her paddle for the first time that evening. The woman was Miranda Cross, my hired consultant, bidding on behalf of Celeste Hartwell. According to the strategy we'd discussed, Miranda would enter the bidding at critical moments to drive prices higher while gathering intelligence about other serious collectors. Her presence suggested that Celeste remained actively interested in acquiring additional Meridian pieces, a development that would terrify Harrison if he recognized its implications. Whispered Truths ultimately sold for $3.4 million to Miranda's phone bidder. Harrison's defeat was written across his face as he realized that not only was someone competing for his artist's work, but they possessed resources that exceeded his own. His carefully constructed monopoly on Meridian was being challenged by forces he couldn't identify or control. The final piece, Renaissance Echo, represented the culmination of my artistic journey to that point. I'd spent over a year developing the techniques needed to achieve the specific effects I'd envisioned, classical painting methods applied to contemporary subject matter in ways that created dialogue between historical and modern perspectives. The piece was simultaneously an homage to masters like Vermeer and Caravaggio and a commentary on how their techniques could address current social and political themes. When Renaissance Echo appeared on the preview screens, the room's energy shifted noticeably. Even in the digital projection, the painting's technical sophistication was evident. Conversations throughout the audience became more animated as collectors and critics processed what they were seeing. "This is extraordinary work," I heard a woman behind me whisper to her companion. "The brushwork in the background figures rivals anything being produced today." Hartford's presentation was more detailed for the final lot. Renaissance Echo represents perhaps Meridian's most ambitious work to date, demonstrating a technical mastery that places this artist among the most important contemporary voices working in traditional media. The composition's complexity rewards extended viewing, revealing new details and relationships with each encounter. Harrison's strategy for the final piece was desperate. He opened the bidding at the full reserve price of $1.5 million, attempting to intimidate other collectors through his apparent certainty about the work's value. But his calculation backfired spectacularly as multiple serious bidders interpreted his aggression as confirmation that the piece was significantly undervalued. The bidding war that ensued was unlike anything I'd witnessed in my years attending lesser auctions. Paddle signals flashed throughout the room as collectors who rarely competed against each other directly engaged in open warfare for the piece. Harrison maintained his participation until the price reached $4 million, at which point his resources were apparently exhausted. But the bidding continued climbing. $4.2 million, $4.5 million, $4.8 million. Each increase brought gasps from the audience as Renaissance Echo approached record territory for a contemporary artist's work at auction. When the hammer finally fell at $5.1 million, the room erupted in applause. Renaissance Echo had achieved the third highest price ever paid for a work by a living artist at auction. The buyer was again Miranda's phone bidder. Celeste Hartwell had just made one of the year's most significant art acquisitions. Harrison sat in stunned silence as the audience celebrated around him. In a single evening, 3 pieces by his exclusive artist had generated nearly $11 million in sales, all to a mysterious collector he couldn't identify. His monopoly on S45 estates and number 5 and S45. Meridian had been shattered, and worse yet, he had no way to contact the artist to understand how these pieces had reached the market. As the auction concluded and attendees began filtering toward the reception area, I watched Harrison attempt to approach Miranda Cross. His conversation with her was brief and clearly unsatisfactory. Miranda's professional discretion meant she revealed nothing about her client's identity or intentions. Harrison's frustration was evident as he realized that his usual network of contacts and influence meant nothing against someone who'd chosen to remain completely anonymous. The evening's success was intoxicating, but I knew the real confrontation was yet to come. Harrison would spend the following days attempting to track down Celeste Hartwell and understand how she'd acquired pieces by an artist he believed he controlled exclusively. When those efforts failed, he would be forced to confront the possibility that his entire operation was built on foundations more fragile than he'd realized. I left the auction house that evening, having witnessed the art world recognize my work as worthy of museum-quality collections and record-breaking prices. The girl who'd been told her paintings lacked commercial appeal had just seen them sell for millions to sophisticated collectors who understood their true value. But financial vindication was only part of my plan. The real revelation was still to come, and it would require a face-to-face confrontation that would force Harrison to account for 3 years of theft, manipulation, and psychological abuse. The stage was set for a meeting that would determine whether justice was possible in a world where reputation and connections often mattered more than truth. The following Monday morning, I arrived at Meridian Gallery with the same punctuality I'd maintained for 3 years, carrying Harrison's usual coffee order and wearing the professional demeanor that had made me nearly invisible in his world. But everything had changed, even if Harrison didn't know it yet. I possessed evidence of his crimes, documentation of my true artistic identity, and most importantly, the knowledge that my work was valued by the very collectors whose opinions shaped the contemporary art market. Harrison was already in his office when I arrived, hunched over his computer with an intensity I'd rarely seen. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie askew, and dark circles under his eyes suggested he'd spent a sleepless weekend attempting to unravel the mystery of Saturday's auction results. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," I said, placing his coffee on the desk with the same careful attention to placement I'd practiced for years. "How was your weekend?" He looked up with bloodshot eyes that held a mixture of frustration and paranoia. "Complicated," he replied shortly. "I need you to research everything you can find about a collector named Celeste Hartwell, European background, recently widowed, apparently specializing in contemporary work." I maintained my neutral expression while internally celebrating his obvious distress. "Of course. Any particular focus for the research?" "Everything," he said, turning back to his computer screen. "Financial background, collecting history, how she acquired those Meridian pieces. Someone with that kind of purchasing power doesn't appear overnight without leaving traces." For the next several hours, I performed an elaborate charade of researching Celeste Hartwell, while Harrison made increasingly desperate phone calls to contacts throughout the art world. I watched him attempt to reach Miranda Cross, only to be politely deflected by her assistant. I listened as he called auction house specialists who could provide no additional information about the mysterious collector who dominated Saturday's Meridian sales. By afternoon, Harrison's composure had deteriorated significantly. He'd consumed 3 additional cups of coffee, snapped at 2 different clients who'd called with routine inquiries, and spent 20 minutes staring out his office window in apparent contemplation of a problem he couldn't solve. It was then that I made my first strategic move. "Mr. Blackwood," I said, entering his office with a manila folder, "I found something interesting in my Celeste Hartwell research." His attention focused on me with laser intensity. "What did you find?" I placed the folder on his desk and opened it to reveal a carefully constructed timeline of Celeste's collecting activities. "She's been acquiring Meridian pieces for over 2 years," I said, pointing to forged documentation showing earlier purchases. "But here's what's interesting. According to insurance records I was able to access, she's been working with an advisor who claimed to have inside information about Meridian's creative process." Harrison's face paled as he processed the implications. If someone had been providing insider information about Meridian, it could only have come from his gallery, the sole source of the artist's work. But he'd been extremely careful to limit access to information about his operation. "What kind of inside information?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled panic. I pretended to consult my notes. "The documentation isn't specific, but there are references to authentic creative documentation and verified artistic process materials. The insurance valuations suggest these materials significantly increased the perceived value of her collection." This was the moment I'd been building toward for weeks. Harrison was now faced with the possibility that someone within his operation had been documenting his theft and selling that information to competitors. His paranoia would force him to examine his own security measures and question everyone with access to sensitive information about Meridian, including his seemingly innocent gallery assistant. "Saffron," he said slowly, using my first name for perhaps the 3rd time in 3 years. "Have you ever noticed anyone showing unusual interest in Meridian materials? Anyone asking questions about authentication processes or documentation procedures?" I allowed a moment of apparent confusion to cross my face. Not specifically, but I paused, as if uncertain whether to continue. "But what?" Harrison's voice carried an edge of desperation. "Well, there was that art journalist who came by last month, Rebecca Martinez from Art News. She asked a lot of detailed questions about how you authenticate pieces by emerging artists. And she seemed particularly interested in your storage and documentation systems." This was completely fabricated. Rebecca Martinez was a real journalist, but our interaction had been limited to a brief email exchange about the auction preview. However, Harrison's paranoid state made him receptive to any explanation that didn't implicate his core operation. "What exactly did you tell her?" he demanded. "Nothing specific," I assured him. "I explained that authentication procedures were confidential and directed her to speak with you directly. But she did spend quite a bit of time looking around the gallery space before leaving." Harrison stood abruptly and began pacing behind his desk. "This is a disaster," he muttered. "If someone's been documenting our procedures with Meridian, it could compromise the entire market for the artist's work." The slip was telling. He'd almost said "my procedures" before correcting to "our procedures." Even in his panicked state, Harrison maintained the fiction that Meridian was a separate entity rather than a creation of his own manipulation. "Should I try to contact this Celeste Hartwell?" I suggested innocently. "Perhaps we could arrange a meeting to discuss future acquisitions?" "No," Harrison said quickly. "Absolutely not. Any direct contact could be seen as inappropriate, given the market dynamics involved." His refusal to pursue contact with such a significant collector revealed the depth of his fear. Harrison understood that any serious investigation of his relationship with Meridian would expose his entire operation. He was trapped between his desire to control the market for his artist and his need to avoid scrutiny that would reveal the theft underlying his success. I spent the remainder of the afternoon documenting Harrison's increasing desperation while maintaining my facade of loyal assistance. He made dozens of phone calls attempting to gather intelligence about Celeste Hartwell, each conversation revealing more of his panic to potential witnesses. He researched art fraud investigation procedures, read articles about authentication disputes, and repeatedly accessed the safe containing his most sensitive Meridian documentation. By evening, Harrison appeared to have reached a decision. "Saffron," he called as I prepared to leave for the day. "I need you to come in early tomorrow." We're going to conduct a complete review of our Meridian documentation to ensure everything is properly organized. I nodded professionally while recognizing this as Harrison's attempt to assess whether his records contained any evidence that could be used against him. He would spend the evening reviewing every document, looking for potential vulnerabilities in his operation. What he wouldn't discover until tomorrow was that his most dangerous vulnerability had been sitting across from his desk for 3 years, learning his methods, observing his weaknesses, and planning the perfect moment to reveal the truth. That evening, I made my final preparations for the confrontation that would determine whether justice was possible in Harrison's carefully constructed world of lies. I organized my evidence into an irrefutable timeline of theft, documented every financial transaction that proved my ownership of the sold paintings, and prepared for a conversation that would either vindicate 3 years of abuse or destroy my chances of ever working in the art world again. The game Harrison had started when he decided to steal my work was finally approaching its endgame. Tomorrow, he would discover that his most submissive employee had become his most dangerous opponent. Tuesday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that only comes after sleepless nights spent preparing for battle. I entered Meridian Gallery at 7:30, an hour before our normal opening time, carrying a leather portfolio that contained 3 years of carefully gathered evidence. Harrison was already there, his office illuminated against the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by stacks of documents that represented his desperate attempt to identify vulnerabilities in his operation. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," I said, maintaining the professional tone that had defined our relationship for 3 years. "You wanted to review the Meridian documentation?" He looked up from his desk, his appearance even more disheveled than the previous day. His expensive shirt was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and his silver hair unkempt. The confident art dealer who commanded respect throughout New York's galleries had been replaced by a man consumed with paranoid calculation. "Yes," he said shortly. "I want to examine every piece of paper related to Meridian. Authentication certificates, correspondence with auction houses, insurance documentation, everything. We need to ensure there are no discrepancies that could be used to question the artist's provenance." I nodded and moved toward the safe, but Harrison waved me away. "I'll handle the safe myself," he said, suspicion evident in his voice. Even in his desperation, he wasn't prepared to allow me complete access to his most sensitive materials. For the next hour, we worked in tense silence as Harrison methodically reviewed every document in his Meridian files. I observed his process while pretending to organize authentication materials, noting how his anxiety increased with each invoice that proved his financial benefits from selling my work. The moment of revelation came when Harrison discovered a document that shouldn't have existed, a detailed analysis of Meridian's painting techniques that I'd planted in his files weeks earlier. The analysis was accurate because I'd written it myself, describing the specific methods I used to achieve certain visual effects in my work. But according to Harrison's records, no such technical documentation should have existed unless Meridian had provided it directly. "Where did this come from?" Harrison demanded, holding up the technical analysis. "I don't remember receiving any documentation like this from Meridian." I approached his desk and examined the document with apparent confusion. "It was in the authentication folder," I said innocently. "I assumed you'd requested it from the artist for insurance purposes." Harrison's face went through a series of expressions as he processed the implications. If he hadn't requested this documentation, someone else had either accessed his files or possessed independent knowledge of Meridian's techniques. Both possibilities suggested security breaches that could destroy his operation. "This is impossible," he muttered, comparing the technical analysis to authentication certificates for pieces he'd sold. "The level of detail here. This could only come from someone with direct access to the artist's studio." It was time for the final gambit. "Mr. Blackwood," I said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you about Meridian." His attention snapped to me with predatory intensity. "What do you know about Meridian?" I maintained steady eye contact as I delivered the words that would end his world. "I know exactly who Meridian is, because Meridian is me." The silence that followed was absolute. Harrison stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language, his brain struggling to process information that contradicted 3 years of carefully constructed reality. "That's impossible," he said finally. S. Meridian is an established artist with a documented history of sales dating back years. I opened my portfolio and placed the first piece of evidence on his desk, a photograph of me painting Midnight Reverie in my apartment studio, with newspapers visible in the background showing dates from over a year ago. S. Meridian is a pseudonym you created, I said calmly. You've been selling my paintings under that name while convincing me they were worthless amateur work. Harrison's expression shifted from confusion to recognition to horror as the magnitude of his exposure became clear. You're insane, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. You're a gallery assistant, you do coffee runs and client relations. I placed additional evidence on his desk methodically, bank records showing his deposits from S. Meridian sales, emails proving his communication with auction houses about my work, and most damning of all, the original sketches and preparatory studies for every painting he'd sold under the false identity. I have documentation proving that every S. Meridian piece sold through your gallery was created by me in my apartment studio, I continued. I have witnesses who can testify to seeing me work on these pieces. I have materials analysis that will prove the paintings were created with supplies I purchased, not by some mysterious artist you've never been able to produce for authentication. Harrison's composure crumbled completely as he realized the scope of my evidence. You can't prove anything, he said desperately. It's your word against mine. I'm an established dealer with impeccable credentials. Actually, I replied, it's my evidence against your lies, and I've already shared that evidence with some very interested parties. I placed a final document on his desk, a letter from the FBI's art crime team acknowledging receipt of a comprehensive report detailing Harrison's theft and fraud operation. The letter was dated the previous day and signed by Special Agent Maria Santos, who specialized in art fraud investigations. Harrison's face went gray as he read the FBI correspondence. This is extortion, he whispered. No, I corrected him. This is justice. You stole my work, destroyed my confidence, and profited from my talent while convincing me I had none. You've committed fraud on a massive scale and you're going to face the consequences. The power dynamic that had defined our relationship for 3 years had reversed completely. Harrison, who'd commanded respect and fear throughout the art world, now sat exposed and vulnerable before the assistant he'd systematically abused. What do you want? He asked, resignation beginning to replace panic in his voice. I want you to understand what you've done, I said. Those paintings you dismissed as amateur work have sold for $15 million. The artist you convinced wasn't good enough for your gallery walls just set auction records at Pemberton. You didn't just steal my work, you stole my belief in myself. Harrison remained silent, perhaps finally understanding the psychological dimensions of his crimes. But mostly, I continued, I want everyone to know the truth about Saint Meridian. The artist exists, and she's standing right in front of you. I gathered my evidence and prepared to leave. The FBI will be here within the hour to execute a search warrant for your records. I suggest you use that time to contact a criminal defense attorney. As I reached the gallery door, Harrison called out one final time. Saffron, wait. We can work something out. A partnership, perhaps. Split the profits going forward. I turned back to face him, this man who'd shaped 3 years of my life through manipulation and theft. Mr. Blackwood, I don't need your partnership. I never did. I just needed to believe in myself enough to recognize my own worth. I walked out of Meridian Gallery for the last time, leaving Harrison to confront the wreckage of his carefully constructed empire. Within hours, FBI agents would begin dismantling his operation, seizing records that would prove my allegations and potentially uncover additional victims of his schemes. But my victory extended beyond legal vindication. The girl who'd entered Harrison's gallery 3 years earlier, crushed by student debt and desperate for validation, had become a woman who understood her own value. The artist who'd been told her work lacked commercial appeal had just proved that sophisticated collectors considered it worthy of millions. 6 months later, I stood in my own gallery space in Chelsea, surrounded by paintings that bore my real name and told my authentic story. The opening night reception was packed with collectors, critics, and fellow artists who'd come to see the work of the artist formerly known as S. Meridian. Harrison Blackwood was notably absent, having begun serving a 5-year federal sentence for art fraud and money laundering. My first solo exhibition, titled Revelations, featured not only my recent work but also the paintings that had originally been sold under Harrison's deception. Celeste Hartwell had graciously loaned the 3 pieces she'd acquired at the Pemberton auction, allowing the art world to see the complete narrative of deception and vindication that had defined my journey from gallery assistant to recognized artist. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a new painting I'd completed specifically for the show. The Dealer's Gambit depicted a chessboard where the pieces wore masks, their true identities hidden beneath facades of respectability and power. In the background, barely visible unless viewed from the correct angle, the ghostly outline of an artist's palette suggested that creativity would ultimately triumph over manipulation. Miranda Cross attended the opening, her professional relationship with Celeste having evolved into genuine friendship as we'd worked together to expose Harrison's crimes. "You know," she said, studying The Dealer's Gambit with expert eyes, "this piece shows more technical sophistication than anything in your Meridian period. Trauma has a way of deepening an artist's vision." She was right. The paintings I'd created since Harrison's arrest possessed an emotional complexity that my earlier work, while technically proficient, had lacked. Understanding betrayal had taught me to recognize authenticity. Surviving manipulation had strengthened my connection to my own creative voice. Among the evening's attendees was Rebecca Martinez, the ART news journalist whose name I'd used to heighten Harrison's paranoia during our final confrontation, when I'd eventually contacted her with the real story of Meridian's identity. She'd written a comprehensive expose that had earned her a National Arts Journalism Award and permanently destroyed Harrison's reputation in the art world. "How does it feel," Rebecca asked during a brief interview, "to see your work displayed under your real name for the first time?" I considered the question while watching gallery visitors examine my paintings with the serious attention I'd always hoped my work would receive. "It feels like coming home," I said finally. "For 3 years I lived as a stranger to myself, believing lies about my own abilities. Tonight, I'm finally introducing the world to who I really am." The financial success of the exhibition exceeded even my optimistic projections. By the end of the opening night, red dots marked sold pieces totaling over $2 million in sales. But more important than the money was the recognition from fellow artists, critics, and collectors who appreciated my work for its authentic artistic merit rather than manufactured mystique. Tommy Reeves, the struggling artist who'd unknowingly helped me forge Celeste Hartwell's documentation, approached me near the end of the evening. "I have to ask," he said quietly, "that novel you said you were researching, was any of that true?" I smiled, remembering how desperate I'd been to maintain secrecy during the planning phases of my operation. The novel was about an artist who discovers her dealer has been stealing her work. I admitted, "I suppose you could say I was conducting very immersive research." Tommy laughed, shaking his head in amazement. "Harrison always said you were smarter than you let on. Turns out he was right about something after all." As the evening wound down and guests began filtering out into the Chelsea night, I found myself alone with my paintings for the first time since their installation. These works represented more than artistic achievement. They were proof that truth could triumph over systematic deception, that talent could survive attempts to destroy it, and that sometimes the best revenge was simply living well enough to render your oppressor's opinions irrelevant. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For a moment, I worried it might be Harrison, attempting some final manipulation from prison. But the message was from Agent Maria Santos of the FBI's art crime team. "Saw the review in the Times. Congratulations on your success. Your case helped us identify 3 other dealers running similar schemes. Your courage to come forward has protected more artists than you know." The investigation that had begun with my stolen paintings had indeed uncovered a broader network of art fraud affecting dozens of emerging artists who'd been systematically exploited by dealers they'd trusted. Harrison's detailed records, seized during the FBI raid, had provided evidence of connections to other galleries where young artists were being manipulated and cheated out of their rightful profits and recognition. 2 weeks after my exhibition opening, I received an unexpected visitor at my new studio space. The woman who knocked on my door was young, perhaps 25, with paint-stained fingers and the nervous energy I remembered from my own early days as an artist. "Miss Pierce?" she said hesitantly. "My name is Alex Chen. I read about your case in Art News and I think," I think my dealer might be doing something similar to what happened to you." I invited her in and listened as she described a pattern that was disturbingly familiar. Her dealer praised her work privately while dismissing it publicly, maintained exclusive control over her artistic output, and had recently mentioned discovering pieces by a mysterious new artist whose style bore striking similarities to Alex's own techniques. "What should I do?" Alex asked, her voice carrying the same desperation I'd felt during my darkest moments of self-doubt. I looked around my studio, at the paintings bearing my real name and the evidence of hard-won success covering every surface. "First," I said, "you document everything, every conversation, every piece you create, every interaction with your dealer. Build an unshakable record of the truth." Over the following months, I found myself becoming an informal advocate for artists facing similar exploitation. Alex's case, with proper documentation and legal support, resulted in her dealer's prosecution and the return of over 30 paintings that had been sold without her knowledge. Others weren't as fortunate. Some dealers had covered their tracks better than Harrison, while some artists lacked the resources to pursue lengthy legal battles. But each case reinforced my understanding that the art world's power structures often protect those with established reputations over those still building their careers. The same galleries and auction houses that had celebrated Meridian's mysterious talent were sometimes reluctant to acknowledge how that talent had been systematically abused. 1 year after Harrison's conviction, I received an invitation that brought the entire journey full circle. The Pemberton Auction House was hosting a special exhibition titled Authentic Voices, Artists Reclaiming Their Narratives, featuring work by artists who'd overcome various forms of exploitation and misrepresentation in the art market. The invitation to participate came personally from James Hartford, the auctioneer who'd sold my pieces during that pivotal evening when Harrison's world began to crumble. "Your story has become legendary in our community," he wrote. "We'd be honored to feature your work in an exhibition that celebrates artistic integrity over market manipulation." The irony wasn't lost on me. The same auction house where I'd watched Harrison's desperation unfold was now celebrating my triumph over his deception. But more than irony, it represented genuine progress in an industry that had historically protected dealers over artists. For the Pemberton exhibition, I created a new series called Unmasked. Each painting depicted the same subject, an artist's studio, but with different elements revealed or concealed depending on the viewing angle. From one perspective, the studio appeared empty, the artist absent or invisible. From another angle, the artist was clearly present, working intently on a canvas that reflected their true vision rather than market expectations. The exhibition opening was attended by many of the same collectors who'd bid on my work during its Meridian period. Several approached me with apologies, explaining that they'd had no idea about the deception underlying their purchases. But others admitted they'd suspected something unusual about the mysterious artist whose work never appeared at major galleries despite commanding such high prices. "The art world has always been full of carefully maintained mysteries," one collector confided. "We sometimes prefer not to ask too many questions if the work speaks to us aesthetically. Your case has forced many of us to examine our own complicity in systems that can exploit artists." This acknowledgement of systemic issues felt more valuable than individual apologies. Real change in the art world would require collectors, auction houses, and galleries to implement better practices for verifying artistic authenticity and ensuring that artists received proper credit and compensation for their work. During the exhibition, I was approached by Sarah Kim, a documentary filmmaker who'd been following my story since the initial Art News exposé. "I'd like to create a film about your experience," she explained. "Not just the Harrison case, but the broader issues of artistic exploitation and the courage required to fight back against established power structures." The documentary project, which I agreed to support, would eventually reach audiences far beyond the art world. The Saffron Deception premiered at Sundance 2 years later, winning awards for its examination of how young artists could be systematically manipulated by those claiming to support their careers. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. During a gallery visit, I was approached by an elderly woman who introduced herself as Eleanor Harrison, Harrison's mother. I tensed, expecting confrontation or blame, but her demeanor was gentle and apologetic. "I wanted to thank you," she said quietly. My son lost his way somewhere along his journey, and what he did to you was inexcusable. But your courage in exposing his crimes gave him a chance to face the truth about himself. He's been getting help in prison, working with therapists to understand how he became someone capable of such deliberate cruelty. She paused, looking at one of my recent paintings. He asked me to tell you that he knows sorry isn't enough, but he wanted you to know that he finally understands what he stole from you. Not just your work, but your confidence in yourself. I didn't know how to respond to this unexpected message from Harrison himself. The man who'd systematically destroyed my self-worth was apparently beginning to comprehend the psychological dimensions of his crimes. Whether his remorse was genuine or simply another manipulation was impossible to determine, but his mother's visit provided a strange form of closure to the most painful chapter of my artistic journey. 5 years after walking out of Meridian Gallery with my evidence portfolio, I stood in the same Chelsea space that had hosted my first solo exhibition, now preparing for a retrospective of my work titled Found. The Art of Saffron Pierce. The exhibition would span my entire career, from the pieces originally sold as S. Meridian through my latest works exploring themes of identity, authenticity, and resilience. The retrospective's catalog included an essay I'd written about the experience of artistic theft and recovery. In it, I tried to articulate lessons that extended beyond the art world to anyone who'd been told their dreams weren't valuable enough to pursue. For 3 years, I allowed someone else's assessment of my worth to define my reality. I believed lies about my abilities because they came from someone I'd been taught to respect as an authority. The path back to recognizing my own value required not just gathering evidence of crimes committed against me, but rebuilding trust in my own perceptions and judgments. The art world, like many industries, has historically rewarded those who can manipulate narratives more than those who create authentic work, but authenticity has a power that manipulation can never match. Truth, when properly documented and courageously presented, can overcome even the most sophisticated deception. To any artist reading this who's been told their work isn't good enough, remember that artistic value isn't determined by someone else's ability to profit from your talent. Your voice matters. Your vision has worth. And sometimes the most important audience for your work is yourself, the person who needs to believe in your abilities enough to keep creating despite discouragement. The retrospective opening was attended by over 500 people, including many of the artists I'd helped advocate for after my own case was resolved. Alex Chen was there with her boyfriend, both of them successful artists now showing work under their real names. Tommy Reeves had parlayed his restoration skills into a thriving business serving museums and private collectors who valued artistic integrity over convenient shortcuts. Even Miranda Cross attended, though by now our professional relationship had evolved into genuine friendship. You know, she said, studying the chronological arrangement of my work throughout the gallery, you can see the exact moment when your art becomes truly powerful. It's right here. She pointed to the first painting I'd completed after Harrison's arrest. This is when Saffron Pierce finally became visible in her own work. She was right. The paintings I'd created while believing Harrison's lies about my abilities, though technically skilled, lacked the emotional depth that came from understanding my own worth. The work I'd produced after recognizing the truth about my talent possessed a confidence and authenticity that made them unmistakably mine. As the evening progressed, I found myself in conversation with James Hartford, who'd become something of a friend since the original Pemberton auction. "Any regrets?" he asked. "About the way everything unfolded?" I considered his question while watching visitors examine my work with the serious attention I'd always hoped it would receive. "None about exposing Harrison," I said finally. "My only regret is that it took me 3 years to trust my own perceptions enough to investigate what was happening." The retrospective ran for 3 months, during which time it traveled to galleries in Los Angeles, Chicago, and eventually London. Each venue added its own context to my story, demonstrating how artistic exploitation was a global issue affecting creators in every cultural environment. But beyond the success and recognition, the most meaningful outcome of my journey was the network of artists, advocates, and industry professionals working to prevent others from experiencing similar exploitation. The Saffron Pierce Foundation, established with profits from my exhibitions, provided legal support and documentation resources to artists facing potential fraud or manipulation by dealers and galleries. Today, as I prepare for my latest exhibition featuring works created 7 years after first walking into Harrison's gallery as a hopeful young artist, I'm struck by how completely my life has been transformed. The girl who once doubted her own artistic abilities now mentors others facing similar challenges. The assistant who fetched coffee and arranged gallery events now owns spaces where emerging artists can display their work under their real names with proper credit and compensation. Harrison Blackwood was released from federal prison last year after serving 4 years of his sentence. According to news reports, he's working as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm in Ohio, his art world connections permanently severed. I occasionally wonder if he thinks about the paintings that made him wealthy or the artist whose confidence he systematically destroyed in pursuit of profit. But mostly, I focus on the future, on the artists whose stories are still being written, whose talents are still developing, whose voices deserve to be heard without manipulation or exploitation. The art world will always contain those who seek to profit from others' creativity, but it also contains those committed to ensuring that talent is recognized, properly credited, and fairly compensated. The gallery assistant who once believed she wasn't good enough to display her work alongside established artists has become someone who ensures that no artist has to face that lie alone. And perhaps that transformation, more than any individual painting or exhibition, represents the truest form of artistic success, using your experiences to create something meaningful that extends beyond yourself. My name is Saffron Pierce, and I finally know exactly who that person is. If you've ever been told your dreams aren't worth pursuing, or if you've faced those who tried to profit from your talents while diminishing your confidence, remember that your voice matters and your vision has value. Sometimes the most important step towards success is simply refusing to accept someone else's assessment of your worth. Drop a comment below about your own experiences with believing in yourself when others didn't. Hit that subscribe button if this story resonated with you, and remember, authenticity always triumphs over manipulation, even when the victory takes longer than you'd hoped.